The desert floor of Nevada does not give up its secrets. But in the late 1970s, under the cover of a moonless sky, the very definition of aerial warfare was being rewritten in silence. The air at Groom Lake, a dry bed known to the world only as Area 51, crackled with a tension that was as electric as it was clandestine. Here amidst the sagebrush and the blinding heat of the day, a team of engineers from Lockheed's legendary Skunk works was toiling over a shape that defied every convention of aerodynamics. It was a jagged-faced thing, a diamond chipped from obsidian, something that looked less like a flying machine and more like an artifact from a dying alien civilization. This was the birth of the F-117 Nighthawk, a ghost in the machine of Cold War paranoia. The pilots who first laid eyes on it, men who had tamed the sound barrier and wrestled with the most advanced fighters on Earth, were baffled. They called it the hopeless diamond, convinced that the laws of physics would swat it from the sky. But the Nighthawk was not built to dogfight. It was built to disappear. The genesis of this shadow lay not in American ingenuity alone, but in a forgotten Soviet mathematical paper that theorized radar waves could be scattered by flat surfaces and sharp angles. While the Soviets dismissed the theory as impractical, Benrich and his team at Skunk Works saw the key to invisibility. They fed the equations into computers that were primitive by modern standards, crunching numbers until a shape emerged that was so unstable it required fly-by-wire technology just to keep it airborne. The first test flights were exercises in pure terror and exhilaration. As the prototypes, codenamed Hablu, took to the air, they were more unstable than a leaf in a hurricane, corrected thousands of times per second by onboard computers. The pilots were essentially flying a falling brick, kept aloft by the sheer force of mathematics. When the engines roared to life, they didn't just push an aircraft. They propelled a secret that would remain buried for over a decade. By the early 1980s, the program had moved to the Tonopah Test Range, a remote outpost where the bandits, the first cadre of F-117, pilots lived a life of nocturnal isolation. They slept while the sun baked the desert and flew only when the darkness was absolute. The psychological toll was immense. They were flying a machine that didn't exist, in a squadron that wasn't on any official roster, practicing for a war they hoped would never come. Every night was a dance with death in the pitch black. They flew with lights out, radio silent, trusting their instruments and the strange, flat-bottomed beast beneath them. The Nighthawk was not fast. It was subsonic. It carried no guns, no sidewinders for self-defense. Its only armor was the void. If a pilot was seen, he was dead. This reality forged a brotherhood of silence, a monastic order of aviators who knew that their survival depended entirely on remaining a rumor. The world finally caught a glimpse of the shadow in 1989, but its first taste of blood came in the humid, tropical air of Panama. Operation Just Cause was the Nighthawk's debut, a chance to prove that the billions of dollars poured into stealth technology were not in vain. The target was the Rio Haito airfield, a stronghold of Manuel Noriega's forces. The plan was precise, almost surgical. Drop 2 massive 2,000-pound bombs near the barracks to stun the sleeping soldiers, creating a chaotic diversion for the Rangers dropping in. But war is rarely precise. As the F-117s approached, the humidity played havoc with their targeting systems, and a last-minute wind shift complicated the drop. The bombs missed their intended stun points, detonating further away than planned. While the explosions certainly achieved the goal of confusion waking the Panamanian defense, forces to a world of fire and noise, it was an imperfect start. The skeptics pounced. They whispered that the stealth fighter was a gimmick, a fragile toy that couldn't handle the grit of real combat. They were wrong. Panama was merely the dress rehearsal. The main event was waiting in the sands of the Middle East. August 1990 brought the invasion of Kuwait, and with it, the largest mobilization of air power since Vietnam. As the coalition forces gathered for Operation Desert Shield, the F-117s were deployed to Khamis Mushat in Saudi Arabia. They sat in their hangars like brooding vultures, their black, radar-absorbent skin drinking in the desert sun. The pilots, the bandits, knew that if the Cold War turned hot, they would be the tip of the spear. The Iraqi air defense network was a formidable beast, a dense thicket of surface-to-air missiles and anti-aircraft artillery that had been purchased with oil money and hardened by years of war with Iran. Baghdad was touted as one of the most heavily defended cities on Earth, a superfortress of radar and flak. Conventional wisdom said that sending aircraft into that teeth-rattling mall without jamming, support, or suppression fire was suicide. But the Nighthawk was built to defy conventional wisdom. The night of January 16, 1991, changed warfare forever. As the deadline for Iraqi withdrawal ticked down, the F-117s taxied out into the darkness. There was no radio chatter, no afterburners lighting up the runway, just the ominous hum of turbofans as the black jets lifted into the gloom. Major Greg Fies, a veteran of the Panama raid, was leading the first wave. His target was the nerve center of the Iraqi Air Force in downtown Baghdad. As he crossed the border, The sky was silent. Below him, the Iraqi radar operators were scanning their screens, looking for the blips that would signal an attack. They saw nothing. The Nighthawk's faceted surfaces deflected the radar waves away, leaving the screens empty. Feast was flying a ghost as the F-117s pushed deeper into Iraqi airspace. The tension in the cockpits was suffocating. The pilots were alone, miles apart, flying into the heart of the enemy. They could see the lights of Baghdad sprawling out. Before them, a glittering jewel about to be shattered. Suddenly, the sky erupted. The Iraqis, realizing something was there, but unable to lock onto it, began to fire blindly. Tracers arced into the sky like lethal fireworks, a curtain of lead, and fire that the pilots had to fly through. It was a surreal nightmare, flying a steady, level path through a storm of anti-aircraft fire, trusting that the invisibility cloak would hold. Feist lined up his target, the crosshairs on his display locking onto the communications building. He released a GBU-27 laser-guided bomb, a hammer, and banked away. Seconds later, the world watched on CNN as the roof of the telecommunications building in Baghdad blew inward. A precise, devastating strike that severed the head of the Iraqi command. It was the first blow of Desert Storm, and it was struck by a plane that wasn't there throughout that first night. The F-117s dismantled the Iraqi defense network with terrifying efficiency. They struck command bunkers, telephone exchanges, and power grids. They blinded the enemy, leaving the Iraqi army deaf and dumb before the main armada of coalition aircraft even crossed the border. The pilots returned to base with adrenaline coursing through their veins, their aircraft unscrewed. They had flown into the most dangerous airspace in the world and walked out untouched. The legend of the stealth fighter was cemented in the burning ruins of Baghdad. For the next few weeks, the Nighthawks flew with impunity. They were the only aircraft trusted to strike downtown Baghdad, the only ones who could loiter over a target, identify it, and destroy it with pinpoint accuracy while the city exploded around them. The psychological impact on the Iraqis was devastating. They were being hammered by an invisible enemy, their bunkers busted, their bridges dropped, their leadership cut off. The F-117s flew over 1,200 sorties during the Gulf War and dropped 2,000 tons of bombs. They did not lose a single aircraft. Not one. It was a statistical impossibility that became a reality. The hopeless diamond had become the ghost of Baghdad, a weapon of such dominance that it seemed to belong to a different century than the MiGs and SAMs trying to stop it. But hubris is a dangerous companion in war. 8 years later, in the cloudy skies over Serbia, the Nighthawk's cloak of invincibility would finally be pierced. Operation Allied Force, the NATO campaign to stop the ethnic cleansing in Kosovo, saw the F-117s deployed once again, but this was a different kind of war. The terrain was mountainous, the weather was atrocious, and the enemy was cunning. The Serbians, led by astute commanders who had studied the Nighthawk's tactics, knew they couldn't beat the technology, so they decided to beat the pilot. They noticed that the NATO planners, grown complacent after the successes of Desert Storm, were flying the F-117's unpredictable, repetitive flight paths. On the night of March 27, 1999, Lieutenant Colonel Dale Zelko, flying an F-117 callsign Vega 31, lifted off from Aviano Air Base in Italy. The weather was foul, a thick soup of clouds and rain that masked the ground. Zelko was a seasoned pilot, a believer in the stealth creep. He flew his mission, dropping his ordnance on a target near Belgrade, and turned for home. But down in the darkness, waiting in the mud, was the 3rd Battalion of the 250th Air Defense Missile Brigade, commanded by Zoltan Dani. Dani had modified his vintage Soviet SA-3 missile radars to operate on longer wavelengths, frequencies that could briefly detect the stealth fighter when its bomb bay doors were open. He was hunting. As Zelko turned, his bomb bay doors cycled. For a few fatal seconds, the smooth radar-flecting underside of the Nighthawk was broken. On Dani's scope, a fuzz appeared. It wasn't a clear lock, but it was enough. He ordered his men to fire. 2 missiles roared into the overcast sky, guided by the desperate manual corrections of the Serbian crew. Zelko saw them coming too, bright glowworms punching through the cloud deck. The first missile whipped past him, the turbulence buffeting his jet. The second did not miss. It detonated next to the Nighthawk, the blast shredding the left wing and sending the aircraft into a violent, tumbling spin. The G-forces were immense, pinning Zelko to his seat as the world outside became a blur of black sky and spinning earth. He reached for the ejection handle, the one thing a stealth pilot prays, never to use hand-pulled. The canopy blew, and Zelko was rocketed into the freezing Serbian night. As his parachute opened, he watched his invincible aircraft, the pinnacle of American technology, burning on the ground below. He was alone, behind enemy lines, with the entire Serbian army looking for him. The hours that followed were in survival. Zelko buried his parachute, covered himself in mud and leaves, and lay motionless in a drainage ditch as search dogs and soldiers passed within yards of his position. He whispered into his survival radio, broadcasting in distress, signaled to the NATO AWACS circling high above. The rescue mission that launched was a frantic, chaotic scramble of helicopters and A-10 Warthogs, tearing through the Serbian night to find their fallen brother. When the Pavhawk helicopter finally spotted his IR strobe and lifted him out of the darkness, Zelko had been on the ground for 8 hours. The shootdown of Vega 31 was a shock to the world. The ghost could bleed. Pieces of the wreckage were carted off to museums, and rumors swirled that fragments ended up in Russia and China, fueling the next generation of counter-stealth technology. Yet, even with the loss of Vega 31, the F-117 continued to serve. It flew in the opening shock and awe campaign of Operation Iraqi Freedom in 2003, attempting a decapitation strike on Saddam Hussein himself. Once again, the Nighthawks led the way, their jagged silhouettes cutting through the Baghdad night. But the writing was on the wall. The airframes were getting old. The maintenance required to keep the radar-absorbent coating pristine was astronomical, and a new generation of stealth, the F-22 Raptor and the F-35, was on the horizon. These new jets were faster, more agile, and didn't need to hide in the dark. The Nighthawk, the pioneer, was becoming obsolete. In 2008, the Air Force officially retired the F-117. They held a ceremony at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, a funeral for a machine. The remaining jets were flown back to their birthplace at Tonopah, their wings removed and placed in climate-controlled storage. It was the end of an era, or so it seemed. The story of the Nighthawk has a strange lingering postscript. Years after its official retirement, rumors began to drift out of the Nevada desert again. Hikers and plane spotters near the ranges claimed to see the familiar, triangle shape wheeling through the sky. Grainy photos emerged, showing F-117s flying alongside modern fighters. The Air Force eventually admitted the truth. The Nighthawk was not dead. It had become a zombie, a phantom resurrected, to train the next generation. The retired F-117s were being flown as aggressors, using their stealth profiles to test the radars of the F-22s and F-35s, playing the role of enemy stealth fighters in high-stakes wargames. Even in its afterlife, the Nighthawk was still serving, still shrouded in secrecy, still flying the dark corridors of the desert where it was born. The legacy of the F-117 is not just in the targets it destroyed or the wars it helped win. It is in the fundamental shift it caused in the human psyche regarding war. Before the Nighthawk, the night was a shield, a time for armies to rest and regroup. After the Nighthawk, the night became a threat, a time when death could arrive unseen and unheard. It turned the sky into a domain of fear for those on the ground. It proved that shape and math could defeat steel and fire. From the drawing boards of the Skunk works, where chain-smoking engineers dreamed of the impossible, or the flak-filled skies of Baghdad where the bandits proved the impossible was real, the F-117 Nighthawk remains one of the most audacious gambles in military history. It was a weapon built for a specific moment in time, a bridge between the brute force of the industrial age and the digital precision of the information age. It was an ugly, unstable, subsonic aircraft that couldn't turn, couldn't fight, and couldn't run. And yet, for 2 decades, it owned the sky. The dramatic arc of the F-117 is also the story of the men who flew it. Men like L. Whitley, who led the 37th Tactical Fighter Wing into Desert Storm with a cigar in his mouth and a quiet confidence that permeated his squadron. Men like Bandit 261, Greg Fias, who kicked open the door in 2 different wars. And men like Dale Zelko, who faced the ultimate nightmare of a stealth pilot and lived to tell the tale. Their experiences in the cramped cockpit of the Nighthawk, illuminated only by the glow of the infrared displays, are the stuff of modern mythology. They describe the sensation of flying the F-117 as being disconnected from the world, floating in a void where the only reality is the mission. The isolation was total. There was no co-pilot to talk to, no formation lights to follow, just the pilot, the machine, and the dark. One of the most harrowing aspects of flying the Nighthawk was the sheer discipline required. In a conventional fighter, if a missile is fired at you, you brake, you turn, you deploy flares. In the F-117, the doctrine was counterintuitive: do not turn. Turning presents the flat belly or the side of the aircraft to the radar, increasing the cross-section and making you a bigger target. If a pilot saw a missile launch, his best chance of survival was to keep flying straight and level, trusting the stealth to do its work, trusting that the missile would lose its lock and drift harmlessly away. It required a level of nerve that borders on insanity to fly into the teeth of fire and refuse to flinch. The retirement of the fleet has done little to diminish the mystique. The aircraft that sit in the boneyard at Tonopah are kept in Type 1000 storage, meaning they can be recalled to active service if needed. They are the spectral reserves of the Air Force, waiting for a day when their specific brand of invisibility might be needed again. But more than that, they are a testament to a time when American aerospace engineering felt limitless. The Nighthawk was designed in the 1970s using slide rules and punch cards. It went from a concept to a combat-treaty aircraft in record time, driven by the existential threat of the Cold War. It was a black project in the truest sense. funded by secret budgets and protected by layers of deception that would make a spy novelist blush. In the end, the F-117 Nighthawk is more than just a plane. It is a symbol of the unseen. It represents the terrifying realization that what you cannot see can indeed hurt you. It changed the geometry of war, turning the skies into a puzzle of angles and radar waves. As the sun sets over the Nevada desert today, and the long shadows stretch across the runway at Tonopah, one can almost hear the whine of the F-404 engines, the ghost of the Nighthawk preparing for one last sortie into the eternal night. It remains the blackest of the black jets. A jagged silhouette burned forever into the history of warfare, the hopeless diamond that shone brighter than them all. The operational history of the Nighthawk is also paved with near disasters that never made the headlines during its active service. Beyond the famous shootdown in Serbia, there were moments in the Gulf War where luck played as much a role as stealth. Pilots reported instances where Iraqi flak exploded so close that the shockwaves rattled their teeth, or where a lucky optical shot from a ground gunner would rake the fuselage. The airframe was tough, but it wasn't invincible. The composite materials that made up its skin were a nightmare to repair. A single scratch in the radar-absorbent paint could compromise the stealth signature, turning the invisible plane into a beacon on a radar screen. Ground crews worked grueling shifts, often in the dead of night, applying toxic coatings and sealing gaps with meticulous care. They were the unsung heroes of the stealth program, the Martians who kept the spaceships flying. The camaraderie among the F-117 community was unique. Because of the secrecy, they could not brag at the bar or share their war stories with other pilots. They were an island unto themselves. When they deployed to Saudi Arabia, they were kept in a separate compound, away from the F-15 and F-16 pilots. This bred a sense of elitism, but also a profound sense of responsibility. They knew they were the ones who would be called upon to do the heavy lifting when the politicians decided to act. They were the silver bullet.
Even the weapon delivery itself was a dramatic departure from standard bombing runs. In a conventional bomber, you might drop a stick of bombs and hope for a pattern coverage. In the F-117, you were threading a needle. The laser designator had to be held on the target while the aircraft maneuvered away, a delicate dance of avionics and aerodynamics. The footage of laser-guided bombs dropping down ventilation shafts or striking specific windows of a building became the defining imagery of the 1990s wars. It sanitized the violence for the public, making war look like a video game, but for the pilot in the box, it was a high-stakes physics problem with life-or-death consequences. As we look back at the lineage of stealth, the F-117 stands as the great patriarch. The B-2 Spirit, with its flying wing design, and the F-22 Raptor, with its supercruise capability, all stand on the shoulders of the Nighthawk. They learned from its flaws, the lack of radar, the subsonic speed, the instability. But they also inherited its greatest strength, the ability to go where no one else could. The DNA of the hopeless diamond is woven into every fifth and sixth generation fighter being designed today. It proved that the visual spectrum is not the only place where wars are won and lost. The story of the F-117 Nighthawk is a finished chapter in the books of history, but it is a chapter that is reread constantly by military strategists and engineers. It teaches the value of audacity, the power of secrecy, and the undeniable impact of technological superiority. But perhaps most engagingly, it is a story of the human element inside the machine, the lonely pilot flying a geometric oddity through the dark, betting his life on the math of a Soviet physicist and the dreams of American engineers. It is the story of the night the sky learned to keep secrets.